Just gonna spend the first minute of this video talking about the service. Jump to 1 minute if you want to just see the problems I had. Serviced both machines, gave them the 1000-hour service with hydraulic filters, checked all the fluids. Not all of them called for replacement at 1000 hours. It's engine oil and most of the filters with the hydrostat filters, and I make sure to grease all the drive joints that are not. I think it calls for every 500 hours according to the manual. So I do that at each engine oil service. Add some water in here to access some of the drive joints on the harvester. All of the service went quite well, so let's start looking at the problems I had. And first up is the big one. It was actually just one more little problem, but more on that later. I dropped the harvester head, and with messing with the wind-fallen trees and previous years trees stuck in the snow having to be pulled up, I have been talking to myself while doing that and said I should look at the bolts holding this, because I had the story the previous owner had done exactly this at some point, and this was the first tree after big service and I had totally forgotten about looking over these bolts. This is actually right next to the garage where I do my wrenching, bigger wrenchings when I can't bring the machines there, and I had a aspen here kind of leaning over, tried to pull a little on it to see if it would kind of be possible to get it a little upright before bringing it down, and it let go and I was a little too high up, so all the hydraulic hoses are pulled apart and the electrical cables. So let's get into it. Undid all the hydraulic hoses back there, could back the machine away. Later learned that it's good to make a U connection between the feed hose and the return hose, because it wanted to spill a little oil out of that if I touched any functions regarding the crane or the cab. So but just driving it, it wasn't leaking because of that. Was able to bring it into the garage with the tractor holding it, and could get it in there and some wooden blocks to prop it up and start looking at the damage. The big cover on it had suffered some little bit of bends and so on, but not too bad. So that will not need to be replaced at least. The hydraulic hose that the electrical part goes into had been the coupling had been broken, and it had pulled somewhat on the wiring. It actually pulled out fully on the coupling up on the machine, but more on that later. And I loosened a lot of the wiring here to start seeing if I could get access to get it apart down here, and starting to see how bad it was, and eventually I could feed it out there and get access to the connector down here and start getting things apart. Did some tests measuring the wiring from that connector that it had pulled on down to the connector down on the whatever the computer down in the harvester head is called, and this section of the wiring seemed to have survived without issues. That upper part that had been pulled out seemed to have survived quite well also. The electrical section there, it pulled apart some of the markings that were on the wiring, but test the connection on them, they seem to have survived. The terminals were pulled out of the connector itself further up on the arm. While I had been away, my dad had managed to undo all the broken bolts from the swivel connection, this big bearing here. Did use a thread tap to double check that none of the threads were messed up. A couple of them needed a tiny bit of force to go around, but most of them seemed to be in really good condition, so not too worried about that. The old double-ended bolts that were on here were a little different than the new ones. They had more threads on them, and I know that the old nuts at the top of these, because some of them need this kind, because you have a nut on the top, because it's impossible to get a bolt in place. The nut had not really fully engaged, but the original parts here we bought through the Komatsu dealership, they had shorter threads, and it should be fine to kind of bottom these out with some thread lock on them, and there should be enough thread at the top to engage the nut fully. All of these double-ended bolts were put into place. Then we're gonna tackle the hydraulic couplings before we assemble the top end, and this was gonna turn out to be the hardest part of this, I would think, as the couplings are too close to each other to be able to just undo the broken parts and put the new ones in place. The broken pieces could be removed without too much trouble, but then two of them are too close to each other for it to be possible, so that block aluminum part at the end needs to come undone to be able to fit the new couplings. And here you can see the problem. There is not even a chance to get those together, but we put the ones on there that are on the fixed block, and they could be bolted there without a problem, so we didn't have to cut that block apart, at least to fit them. Some cleaning then to be able to undo the aluminum part here, and that required a lot of wrenching. Tried discussing if there are any ways to do a shortcut and not have to remove the computer to get access to undo that aluminum part, and well, they have removed a little material from the bracket holding the computer, and I think they have been able to squeeze a tool in there and do that in the past, but there wasn't room for it. And it turns out I completely missed recording when we bolted the top back in place for some reason. I thought I had video of that, but apparently not. Well, it's back in place at least, and everything went well. There is a spacer that needs to be in there, and it has some holes in it that feeds some of the grease through it, so it's important to get that spacer back into the correct position. We undid the top from the machine itself to like have it in place, and I had blown out a lot of the old grease in there, so here we are gonna fill up with a whole lot of grease, and it was pretty cold, causing some ice buildup. If you see my dad hammering at the door in the back, removing some so the door will work. So, and we could see grease starting to come out from the inside, but that shouldn't matter. It's gonna be filled up fully. Back to the other problems. Could not see any damage on the swivel connections and the short pieces next to them, so they were reused, but the rest of the hydraulic hoses needed to be replaced because they were pulled apart fully, so and I think the hoses was the most expensive part of this failure. A connector to one of the sensors has been pulled off, and it kind of broken the plastic there, but the pins are sticking out, and I could confirm what orientation it had before it was broken, so that was put into place and glued into place, and a zip tie around to hold it, and seemed to work, so happy with that. After that, we brought in the tractor, undid a couple of hydraulic hoses to be able to lift the bar over it to the back to get better access to remove the computer. If you have seen some of my earlier videos, you know I did something here that the bolts holding the computer in place can't spin, so I just have to undo the nut, but the bottommost one is still very hard to access and it's a bit too long, so I ended up cutting it shorter to not have too many extra turns to have to work with, but make it a little easier next time it has to come undone. And with computer out of the way, the bracket behind it could be removed, giving me more access to remove that aluminum block to fit the new couplings. This block was off the machine not too long ago. I fixed some messed up threads for one of the test ports on here. I think that was covered in a video some years back. I didn't end up buying any new gaskets for this. I just made sure they stayed in place and fit the coupling and bolted it back on there and prayed it was gonna hold up, and it seems to hold up. So, and with that in place, everything could, bracket and computer and all of that, could go back into place. Needed to start looking at that kind of bracket holding the different hoses in place, because that had been bent, and I needed to start looking at the electrical connection up here. Here I had learned that you could do that connecting the feed line and return line, and you don't have any leak to talk about when you operate the machine without the harvester head in place. Machine was brought in under a roof to a good position so we could do the welding required to get that bracket holding things back into place. My dad had straightened out the arm thing and built kind of a jig to get it at the proper offset compared to the rest of the arm, but it was a little bit too narrow and needed some adjustments before we could kind of have everything clamped in place and be ready to weld, and had some blankets and stuff to make sure the wind wasn't gonna cause issues. The welding went well. We put some fresh paint on there after we were done, and we're getting closer and closer to finishing up this repair. This is still gonna be kind of a long video. It turned out, as I was looking at getting the hydraulic hose feeding the electrical part in place, that at some point they have used a different coupling than the original one, so this one was not threading on there. So that had to come undone. Luckily I could source a new one locally that worked. The U above the harvester head that connects it could be folded back, so that could be finished up before bringing it outside. New adapter going in place, and then it was just a matter of, because I had most of the markings left for the different the wiring, the different cables. It was just a matter of looking up, and I didn't sure they had the correct ones in the correct place here, the yellow things marking them, and then it was just a matter of pushing them into the connector itself, because it's kind of a push fitting, and I removed the old terminals that had been pulled off, and I ran out the battery in the camera before that, but everything went well. The harvester head was ready to be lifted back outside and be mounted on the machine. It was actually quite nice weather that day, so that was lucky. Would have sucked to do that in really cold, bad weather. And the harvester could be brought into place. We had propped it up, the head on some wooden blocks, and then it was just a matter of being able to line everything up and get close there. The swing brake thing was causing a little bit of issues, needed to be shifted, so a few small problems getting it there, but eventually things lined up and the pins slid into place. with it connected to the machine, it was lifted up and brought back under a roof to hook up the last of the hydraulic hoses and the electrical connector. Seems I missed recording part of that, or I misplaced the videos, but everything went well, and I had marked the hoses where everything first broke, so it was not any problem figuring out where everything was gonna go. So time to test it. And everything seems to work as poorly or as well as before. The upper delimbing knives are still slow to close. That's something I hope to find time this summer to look at in preparation for next year's or next winter's logging season. But the problems after dropping the harvester head seems to have been resolved by now at least, so that's good. And no visible leaks, everything looking good. The cover could be put back into place, and nothing else needed to be done to the harvester head for the rest of the season. Maybe I replaced, no, I had a hose that had come undone on the front to one of the delimbing knives that I think was never covered. I just took that off, replaced the O-ring because it has O-ring seals, and that was all that was required for the harvester head. Now we have another problem with the base machine. And since it was operational again, the first test was to tackle that leaning aspen that caused the harvester head to drop. No, that wasn't the problem. It had seen suffering before this tree, so I can't blame it all on this one, but it was annoying because I had a lot of spruce growing kind of into it. I removed a couple of them also, and the machine was still cold here and I didn't want to over rev it and torture it, so it took a little bit of time to process this one and get everything done, but it was so nice to see the machine working again. So over to the next problem. The last more serious issue was an oil leak at the back of the machine. And there are a whole bunch of hoses back here that goes from the kind of pump region feeding the brakes and activates differentials and so on. And this turned out to be the hose that actually feeds the pressure out from the pump, and as soon as you started, it started spraying, and I could kind of smell something when this happened, but I figured I would take one more tree and then go out and look how bad the leak was, but got a low oil warning before that tree was done, so I just killed it where it was standing and needed to look at it. And it's pretty deep in there under the hydraulic tank, a bunch of hoses. I had pulled one out where we did the second test starter I thought was faulty, because a couple of them looked quite bad, so. And it was impossible to do any video to talk about in under here. Nothing could really be seen. Eventually I could confirm what hose was faulty and have that removed and replaced. And here it seems like I had hydraulic oil on the camera or something, but once the hose was replaced, we fired the machine up and could see that we didn't have any leaks anymore, so that's good. We could close up the skid plate and finish the logging season. I hope to find time this summer to replace a few more of those hoses in there, because at least 3 or 4 of them look seriously worn, but it's quite tight and not something I'm looking forward to looking at, so I will probably postpone it and tackle it when it starts leaking, I'm afraid. We did bring it out next to the road so we could fill up some oil after that leak, but that's it for this video. Have a good day. Thank you.